Some and Now None of You by Is This Username Available or Not? Chapter 6. Now I'm searching the room for an empty seat. Merlin's first few hours back in Camelot were a blur. Everything looked exactly the same. It was unnerving, and as if he hadn't been gone for 2 whole years, rather just a few days. A few villagers even waved at him when he rode past. He really hadn't thought anybody from outside the castle would even remember him, but it was nice to be proven wrong. Morgana and Leon dropped him off at Gwen's house, then went ahead to the castle to fetch Gwen. And probably Lancelot as well. He was under strict orders to stay put until someone returned. So, of course, the second the two had disappeared from sight, Merlin set about reacquainting himself with the village. Not that he would have needed to. He would always know every inch of this place like the back of his hand. Still, what else was there to do? It would take them a while, and yet to find Gwen and the others and make their way back. He walked with no real purpose, letting the village guide him, the rhythm of its quiet life pulling him along. Every now and then, someone would call out his name, and he'd turn and smile and wave. But he didn't linger. He wouldn't know what to say if they asked about his prolonged absence or even his return. And it would make it even harder to leave if Arthur kicked him out again, if he started putting down roots once more. Prat! He was at the bakery trying to convince old Merlin to accept his money in exchange for the warm bread roll she was already stuffing into his cloth bundle when he spotted Gwen through the window. Behind her were Lancelot and Gawain. All three of them were varying levels of concern on their face as they walked around the marketplace, clearly searching for him. Merlin hastily dropped the coins on the counter, grabbed the roll, and was out the door in seconds, ignoring Merlin's following protest. Gwen spotted him first. "Merlin!" she called from a few shops away. He grinned, and they both crossed the distance and met in the middle, tackling each other into a warm hug. They were both laughing and damp-eyed and breathless. When she pulled away, Gawain elbowed Lancelot out of the way to be the next one to hug him, almost lifting him right off the ground. "Thought we lost you again for a minute there," he mumbled. Merlin shook his head. "Not that easy." Lancelot tugged at Gawain's collar until he stumbled back enough for him to crush Merlin in another hug. Merlin was sure he was going to start crying just from how loved he felt in this moment. When he pulled away, Lancelot eyed him with concern. "I do not understand. How are you back now? Is it not dangerous?" Merlin bit his lip. Gawain had a hard look on his face, but Gwen seemed a little less worried. She probably believed Morgana entirely about Arthur having changed. Morgana said she'd deal with it. "Whatever happens, I've got a few hours with you lot, at least." Really, he should be commended for how his voice didn't crack at the show of hints of fear he was feeling. They started to walk back towards Gwen's hut, and Gawain wrapped an arm around his shoulder. "Between us three and Morgana, we won't let Princess run you out again." Gwen opened the door and lit a lantern. It was steadily approaching dusk. "I really don't think Arthur will do that." Behind her, Lancelot nodded, then said, "Still, it's risky. He's a bit of a loose cannon these days. I don't feel entirely at ease about this." Merlin collapsed on a small love seat beside Gawain. "Nor do I," he admitted. "But Gaius deserves rest, and Arthur's arse needs saving." He shrugged, cutting himself off. It wouldn't do any good admitting that to his friends. They cared too much about him to let him risk his life for the Prat. Again. Not that Merlin would be risking his life this time. No, that kind of stupidity came with his past blind loyalty and love, because yes, Merlin had long accepted that that's what it had been. Tangled and unspoken, but love all the same. Without those, he'd make more sensible choices. Hopefully. "Well, it's good to have you back." This place wasn't the same without you, Gwen smiled, seeming to understand his need to move on from the previous topic. Gawain groaned. Tell me about it. It's dull here nowadays. I was only one more pathetic bandit attack from packing my bags and leaving again. Gosh, he was scarily similar to Morgana. So it didn't surprise Merlin when Lancelot whacked the back of Gawain's head and argued. He's lying. He went and replaced you with Morgana before he'd even left the castle gates. Gawain gasped in fury. I did not! Gwen settled next to Lancelot on the bench and confirmed. He really did. Thick as thieves, those two are. Merlin laughed when Gawain turned to him and said, It took me at least 2 seasons to come around to her snobbishness, he huffed. No, I'm glad, honestly. I'm sure you two gave him trouble, he grinned. We did, I swear, Gawain crackled in a manner far too similar to Morgana. Like a time we switched Arthur's boots for a pair 2 sizes too small in the morning of a knighting ceremony. Lancelot grinned, remembering. He tried to act all regal while limping down the corridor. Thought he was being cursed. Merlin chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. My personal favorite was when Morgana enchanted Arthur's goblet to always be lukewarm no matter what he poured into it. Merlin groaned in amusement. He hates it when drinks aren't the right temperature. Oh, trust me, we figured that out really fast. Only took him a day to start sending his drink back like some grumpy nobleman. Gawain added merrily. It took Merlin a second to realize Gawain was talking about Morgana's magic. Wait, you know? Gawain gave him a light shove. About you or the lady? Merlin gaped. Both of us? Known about you for years. I can't even remember when the first time was, but after that, it was like you kept slipping up. Gawain ruffled his hair. Merlin couldn't believe it. He was certain. He was cautious about his magic. How on earth had Gawain, usually hungover Gawain, noticed it? You're not angry that I didn't tell you? He asked hesitantly. Of course not. I understand why you thought you couldn't tell anyone. I do wish you had trusted me a little more, though. I'm sorry. Gawain elbowed him. Nothing to apologize about, Merls. Merlin frowned, guilt tugging at his features. No, really. I knew I could trust you, but I guess after so long of keeping it secret, I didn't know how to reveal it. It's all right, Merlin. I'm really not upset over it, he reassured. Merlin glanced at Lancelot and Gwen, who had drifted into their own quiet conversation. They looked so happy together, it felt like something tugged against his chest, something warm, something a little sad. Maybe it was longing, maybe it was just relief that some things at least had turned out all right. Gawain followed his gaze, lowering his voice and said, Between the two of us, they're practically intolerable when they're all besotted like this. Merlin snorted. You're just jealous Lance has found someone to tolerate him before you did. Not at all. I quite enjoy being a free man. Thank you very much. He sounded like he meant it too. Merlin shook his head. He didn't say what he was really thinking. That love like that, steady, forgiving, healing, was rare. And though he was sure he'd never get to have it, it brought him no small amount of joy that 2 of his closest friends did. The next few hours passed too quickly. In catching up, Gwen disappeared early on. After taking his measurements, which was when Merlin found out that tonight was Beltane feast, and he was supposed to be present, in the same room as Arthur. Merlin thought he might throw up. Gawain and Lancelot did a commendable job at distracting him, and the upcoming feast was almost entirely off his mind for a while. They made tea, laughed over more of Morgana and Gawain's mischiefs, some of which they even managed to drag Lance into, and they filled him in on how prattish Arthur had been since Merlin left. Though he was glad when they finally moved on to talk about something else. Overall, it was one of the best days Merlin had had in years. When Gwen returned with formal robes, he was sure the same could not be said about the night. It was likely to be one of the worst of his life. She shooed the other two out, telling them to get ready, for the feast was set to begin in only a few candle marks. They left with promises to save Merlin a seat. Merlin could hear them arguing about who he would sit next to as they left. Merlin rolled his eyes fondly as their bickering faded down the corridor. Gawain was loudly insisting that it had to be him. Obviously, for emotional support, while Lancelot was arguing that Gawain was emotional turbulence at best. Their voices echoed until Gwen shut the door with a soft laugh, shaking her head. His smile disappeared off his face the instant Gwen shoved the bundle of clothes in his hand. The fabric was softer than any he'd ever owned before, and it was far too heavy. Off you go, she nodded towards the changing screen. Why can't I just go in my own clothes? Why do I even have to go at all? He sighed, put out. Gwen smiled placatingly. These are your clothes now. Morgana had them made just for you. You can't show up in such exquisite feast in that. She gestured to his perfectly nice shirt and trousers. When there's an impression to be made. Merlin groaned. Still don't understand why I can't just do all this with less commotion. What's to say Arthur doesn't create a scene right there? He won't. Trust me. And Morgana thinks this is the best way to go about introducing you to the court. Merlin stepped out as he was pulled into the forest green robe. It looked quite good, he had to admit. The color was shrinking and complemented his features, and it fit just right. So I'm right then. Arthur really doesn't know about any of this. It had been a strong hunch since Morgana never outright said he did, and the girl loved her lies of omission. Gwen sighed and handed him a comb. He doesn't, she confirmed, but I promise you nothing bad will happen. He'll be shocked, sure, but believe me, exiling you again will be the last thing on his mind. Yes, because he'll be too busy calling for the executioner. Merlin combed his hair, tangled beyond belief from the long journey, almost carelessly, as if that wasn't his own execution he was talking about. At some point, he'd come to terms with it. Not his death, of course. He won't let Arthur do that, or even banish him again. But he was comfortable now in the fact that this evening would be a horrid and possibly chaotic. He'd deal with whatever was thrown his way when it came to that. Gosh, no! Gwen gasped. Just have a little faith, she pleaded. Merlin sighed and nodded in assent. Though he'd lost all faith in the king 2 years ago. Gwen gave him a soft smile and fixed the collar of his shirt. My neckerchief! She held the red cloth up. Will be safe with me for one night. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Merlin was already beginning to hate this night. He pulled on his boots, also new, and smelled of fresh leather, and the two made their way up to the castle. He wondered, briefly, if the guards that waved at him were the same ones who had watched him leave for the last time. All too soon, they were walking the halls of the castle. Merlin felt as though Arthur might jump out of a wall any second. Gwen seemed to sense his anxiety and kept a comforting hand on his arm as they walked. Maybe she knew he was ready to bolt any second. Merlin drank in all the familiar sights. Nearly every maid or servant they passed stopped to say hi to him, or, at the very least, smile, busy as they were with preparations. It helped ease his nerves just a little. The castle felt the same, and yet not quite. There was different touch with something gentler, less rigid than before. Maybe that was the lack of Uther's heavy presence. Maybe it was time. Still, every stone felt like a memory. Every turn in the corridor reminded him of laughter, of arguments, of secrets whispered behind columns, and magic cast in the dark. It was a horrible, bittersweet feeling. They stopped outside the banquet hall, and Gwen gave his hand a small squeeze. "You'll be all right," she said softly. "They've missed you." Merlin took a breath and nodded and pushed the doors open. It felt like every eye in the room turned to him. Merlin's gaze shot to the head of the table, and he sighed in relief when he saw the king's throne-like chair was still vacant. His eyes then flitted towards where all the knights sat in a row. Gawain was beckoning him over to the empty seat next to him, one right at the end of the table, as far away from the head of the table as possible. The other knights were all giving him wide grins and reassuring nods, but refrained from much more. He assumed they were avoiding calling attention to him, as they must have been filled in already. Merlin went to sit in his seat, feeling all too uncomfortable, even as Gawain pulled him into the conversation with his usual ease. Merlin's attention, however, kept wavering. His eyes kept darting to Arthur's empty chair or the door that remained absolutely shut. It felt like a sword was hanging over his head. Probably Excalibur. Oh, the irony. He was seated at the left wing of the large U-shaped table. Across from him were some of the councilmen, and Morgana was sat next to Arthur's empty chair at the head, whispering something to Gwen. Merlin had never felt more out of place, and the newly stitched stuffed robes weren't helping. His place had always been behind Arthur. Never had he thought he'd be sitting at the feast. It was odd. The Bellatane feast was a grand affair, celebrating the return of warmth and spring. The great hall was appropriately decked out in garlands of flowers, and there were light instruments playing in the distance somewhere. The main table was surrounded by several smaller ones, where other high nobility was seated. There was a mere buzz in the air, and no one seemed to be minding the king's late arrival, happy to enjoy the pleasant atmosphere and chatter amongst themselves. Gawain looked more joyful than Merlin had ever seen him. He was jesting with Percy, usually at the other's expense, dragging Merlin back into the conversation whenever he had noticed his attention start to waver. There were too many eyes on him. Most people at this table recognized him from 2 years ago. The knights kept glancing over, some with concern, others with weariness, and the councilmen whispered amongst themselves with barely concealed curiosity. Morgana remained aloof, occasionally turning to talk to Leon, who sat closest to the head of the table, on the left wing, and gave him reassuring smiles whenever they locked eyes. All this waiting to see what becomes of his fate when Arthur finally arrives was borderline torturous. Better to be put on the pyre right now than to wait for His Majesty to create a scene. "Is he always this late?" Merlin grumbled quietly to Gawain. Gawain snorted. "Likely just taking his time, dressing up extra pretty for you today." Merlin didn't acknowledge the comment with more than a roll of his eyes. It's another candle mark later when Arthur finally walks through the door. Then Merlin's trained eyes can see all the faults in his attire. The strings on his shirt were done up a little too loose, there was a crooked buckle on his ceremonial jacket, and his face was haphazardly shaven. He didn't think a worse servant than him existed. He's quite glad to be proven wrong. Merlin doesn't look at Arthur for more than a second, doesn't dare really see his face, holds his breath when Arthur walks right behind his chair towards the vacant seat. He doesn't hear a word that comes out of Arthur's mouth as he makes a short speech about prosperity and whatnot. He knows Arthur will spot him any second, and it'll all come crashing down. It's that thought that has him finally look up from his dinner plate. As pathetic as it is, he decided he should savor what Arthur looks like when his face is unmarred by anger and disgust that will soon come. As the feast starts, everyone digs into the large spread. Merlin keeps his gaze trained on the man who so cold-heartedly condemned their destiny, drinking in the sight with greedy eyes. He's still the same golden-haired boy with gleaming, crooked teeth and the most expressive blue eyes that crinkle as he merely greets Morgana and Leon, asking how their trip fared. Morgana launches into a carefully planned and rehearsed explanation, and Merlin waits with bated breath, wondering what will happen in the past 2 years to add such solemn heaviness to Arthur's demeanor. His gaze switching between the two of them, trying to piece together which part of the conversation they're at. Neither of them making it easy, with how well-trained they are to keep their faces completely expressionless when they're at court. Still, Merlin doesn't miss Morgana nodding in his direction, and Arthur's face is anything but blank canvas as he whips around to lock eyes on him. Arthur's stare pins him in place, sharp, disbelieving, and so full of something that Merlin can't name. It hurts to look at. For a moment, he's sure neither of them breathe. He immediately turns his gaze to Steele, unwilling to show even a hint of panic and the nerves he's feeling. He thinks time seems to pause as Arthur stares at him, a range of emotions flitting across his face. Shock, then something else that Merlin struggles to pinpoint, till finally he lands on anger. Merlin sucks in a deep breath, readying himself. However, Arthur turns away. His ire is directed towards Morgana in a hushed whisper, and Merlin feels a little guilty for being relieved at that. Next to him, Gawain pours him a glass of wine, and Lancelot gives him a steady nod of assurance. Gawain nudges his arm. "See? All good. What did I say?" Merlin picks up the goblet, drowning half of it, and then returns his gaze to the king, whose still heated conversation with his sister. "All that drink must have messed with your eyesight." He nods subtly in their direction. Gawain shook his head. "You're still here, aren't you?" "Let's celebrate my last meal, then," he says with a resigned expression. Gawain grumbles his arguments back, but Merlin scarcely heard him over the ringing of his own ears. And despite his words, he couldn't bear to do more than toss the food around on his plate for the rest of the evening. So, yes, this was chapter 6. I'm so sorry it took so long to come out. I don't know why, but it was such a chore to read this one. All that angst, I guess, which I usually love, but yeah, it's finally out, and chapter 7 should be easier. I also have to start my other one. I will only be doing the first chapter of that one, just due to the ratings of the second chapter being so dark. It is beautifully well written, so I suggest giving the author as much kudos as possible. And then it's back to Sonoy full time, and we're going to see what's going on while I'm waiting for Like a Moth to a Flame chapter 9. Like, comment, and subscribe. Leave kudos on original site. Drink water and sleep tight.